Welcome, everyone, to this seminar on LGBT activism in difficult political conditions, under uncertainty and under strain. This is the first seminar in a seminar series that's called Queer Lawfare, that looks at how activists working for LGBTIQ rights and recognition are using the law in different ways in different parts of the world. And this seminar series will be taking place throughout this year, and the year is not accidentally chosen, because this year it is 50 years since Norway decriminalized homosexuality. And so it is an important occasion, and that is also why many institutions in Norway are celebrating Queer Culture Year this year. And our seminar series is part of this celebration. And we, in this context, are the Center on Law and Social Transformation and Bergen Global. The Center on Law and Social Transformation is a center that is a collaboration between the Christian Michelsen Institute and the University of Bergen. And the aim of the center is to promote research, education, research communication around the use of law to advance political goals. And of course, this is at the center of this is at the core of what the center does, these questions that we're going to discuss today. And it is also the topic of a new CMI Law Transform research project, which is called Rights Act. And we're going to hear more about that in a minute. But before we get to the project, I'm going to introduce the panelists for today. So my name is Siri Gloppen. I'm going to moderate the session today. I'm the director of Law Transform, and I'm also a professor of political science at the University of Bergen. My colleague sitting next to me here, Lise Rakner, is also a professor of
all the same applies.
Yeah. Also at Law Transform. And we'll talk in a minute about the Rights Act project. The other two panelists sitting with me here are also part of this project. One is Matthew Gichohi, who is a researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute, originally from Kenya and the US. And you'll hear much more from him in a while. And Liv Tønnessen, who is all of these are political scientists, actually. Liv Tønnessen is also a researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute and a co-director with me at Law Transform, and also a specialist on Sudan. And you just arrived yesterday, the day before, from Sudan.
What day is it today? Yeah, Monday.
Yeah. And we'll be able to update us on the situation for queer activists in Sudan. And we also have with us online Ayo. I always call you just Ayo Sogunro from Nigeria, and from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And Ayo is a long-standing friend of Law Transform. It must be 8 years, so 7 years since you came first to Bergen. And I finished last year his excellent PhD thesis and book on queer LGBT activism in Nigeria. And is now doing a postdoc, continuing this same work, and is also an author, a radio host, and a very sort of generally super interesting person with a lot of good reflections. So we're looking forward to hearing about the situation in Nigeria from you. We were also supposed to have 2 Kenyan activists joining us online. One might be joining in a while. The other one was calling in sick this morning. So, but fortunately, we have our in-house expert on no, and that is no laugh at all.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, really, on LGBT activism in Kenya. So we were sort of triple booked, or sort of we had a very good coverage. So that will also be good. So what we're going to do today is that first Lise will tell us a little bit about the Rights Act project, and then we'll go to each of the panelists to get a sense of what the situation is like for LGBT people in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Sudan, and also in Zambia, where Lise has been working extensively. And then after we get this sense, we're going to talk more about the strategies that activists use in these contexts and how they can work with the law, within the law, in these contexts to advance rights. So with that, I give the word to you, Lise.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. So I'm going to tell you about the kind of this juncture of a kind of a long journey, because the Law Transform group, the people sitting around here, we've been working together for a long time. And it's kind of for you sort of young people starting our career, this is kind of how research works. You start somewhere, and then if you're lucky, like I've been, you meet up with really nice people and you have all these great interactions, and lo and behold, a project feeds another project and another project, mainly for personal reasons. Because these are, I cannot stand not having another project and another conference and another Bergen exchanges and another fieldwork with these people. So that's kind of what's driving research. So this project that we just got funding for in the Research Council, actually it was last year. We're starting now, but it's sort of a continuation of a project that we are just about to finalize. And the project we're just about to finalize is as relevant as ever. It's called Breaking Bad, and bad in this sense being backlash against democracy. So for years, we've been working on trying to understand what is it that drives sort of this kind of seeming backlash against democracy. This new project is a continuation of that. And it's called Rights Act. And what we are looking at is what happens to human rights defenders living in context of changing laws and changing political circumstances. Okay, think of yourself as, as a human rights activist. Think of yourself as working actively in Amnesty International, or it could be an environmental organization, an LGBT organization, a land rights organization. And maybe you've even been encouraged to do this kind of work through election campaigns. Maybe, this newspapers, organizations have been openly sort of fighting for this, let it be a green issue or whatever. And suddenly things change. Sometimes it changes overnight. Sometimes it's more incremental. But very often these changes take place through law. And the reason why they take place through law is that gives them legitimacy somehow. Suddenly, a law changes. So your organization can no longer receive funding from abroad. My goodness, you just had a big project with Law Transform or CMI or, NORAD or something. And receiving that money has become illegal. So what do you do? Like, what happens to your project? Oh, and suddenly, speaking of, environmental protection or saving the forest or LGBT or human rights, oh, that's illegal to publish anything on that. So your web page, your organizational web page, is suddenly not only a liability, it's a criminal act. And you are like the web designer of your organization. What do you do? And these things happen either incrementally, suddenly overnight, and you are a human rights defender as an individual, but also as part of an organization. I mean, you have people employed that you need to protect, and suddenly both you and your organization are in grave personal danger, not to mention the human rights issues that you started out defending. Suddenly defending LGBT rights, I was doing the Norwegian, or, saving the forest, whatever, it's becoming criminal acts. This is not a fairy tale. This is not like me explaining, kind of a science fiction book or a criminal detective novel, or, I'm just making up stuff. This happens as we speak all the time. And this has been going on for years and years. And it is this lawfare bit of it, the changes that are in the laws that are making them legal and giving this sort of facade of legitimacy that is making it super difficult. This is what we are going to be working on. The four of us sitting here, colleagues in 4 African countries, colleagues at UC Berkeley, and this is our next 4 years. It's super exciting. Now, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, I should tell you that we are working with human rights defenders in 4 African countries. So it's Nigeria, Zimbabwe, so Ivory Coast in English, and Mali. The 2 French and 2 English-speaking African countries is not a coincidence, because we're actually really concerned with how language plays, and how this is sort of defended and how it's spoken and through language. It's a project that's super ambitious. It's qualitatively, we're going to do qualitative interviews. We're going to be meeting with people. We are going to do surveys. We're going to do survey experiments. And not least, are we hoping through Law Transform and Bergen exchanges that we're going to be able to bring these human rights defenders to Bergen and to sort of have these conversations in a relative safe space. So that's part of the reason why Law Transform is such an important part of this project, and which is also why I'm hoping that you will be part of, listening to this project as it goes along. The rights we're going to be looking at is LGBT rights, it's land rights, and indigenous people's rights. And it's sort of more classical human rights, like, the kind of amnesty type of right. And then labor rights. So I knew it was 4, and I knew I forgot it. Labor is in this context incredibly important.
And women's rights.
Women's rights,
Gender,
which is gender, that I kind of lumped in the human rights, but you're right.
Okay.
But you're right. But it's
all of these are human rights.
But all of these are human rights. So that's but gender rights is also a very important part of the project. I was told to speak for 5 minutes. I spoke for 7.5, and I am now going to give the word.
No, actually, you're going to give it back to me.
Oh, I'm giving it back to her.
Yes,
but at least I was shutting up.
No, because I wanted.
Thank
you. It was brilliant. I just wanted to add that this is also the continuation of another trail of projects, which is actually why we have this composition of countries there, which is not the composition that is in the Rights Act, and that is that we've had. Also at Law Transform, since 2014, projects looking at LGBT lawfare. So, which I has been part of, and also all of us actually. The first was on sexual and reproductive rights lawfare global battles. And the second one, which is about to finish this year, is on political determinants of sexual and reproductive health. And a lot of what we've also learned over the years on LGBT struggles is also sort of coming out of that project. So it's sort of a confluence of different types of streams. And I also wanted to talk to those of your students now to say, if these are issues that you would like to maybe look at in your own work, there is also a possibility of sort of linking up with projects. Okay, but with that, I will actually turn to Ayo and ask you, what is the situation in Nigeria for LGBT people more generally, and for activists?
Thank you very much, Siri, and wonderful project.
We cannot hear you.
Okay, let me try better. Am I audible now?
I'm sure we tested it. There we are.
Now you're in.
I'm audible now.
So
this is
can you try and
interesting.
speak again?
Am I
Now we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you now, so you can just start.
Okay. I can proceed.
Yes, please.
All right. So, of course, I think Nigeria's case is generally fairly well known, but for the benefit of people who this might be their very first encounter with the subject, Nigeria still criminalizes LGBTIQ plus relationships in a variety of ways. It criminalizes identity, it criminalizes advocacy, it criminalizes even the common same-sex acts, same-sex sexual acts. Everything, of course, also started with the legacy of colonial laws, which principally introduced the idea of criminalizing same-sex relationships or acts under the criminal code and the penal code, which had come in by virtue of the Queensland Code in Australia and then the Indian Penal Code. Now, for a long time, these laws were mostly dormant in the sense that they were not really enforced. They were there on the books, but except in periods of political crisis or periods of political change or legitimacy crisis, there was rarely any public debate or conversation or issues around same-sex issues, around homosexuality, or even around queerness in general. And not until the 90s, the late 90s and the early 2000s, as a reaction to changes and progress that was happening in Europe and in America, the politicians in Nigeria began to feel that they had an interest in the topic. And then there began to be this new wave of criminalizing laws, which not only attempted to criminalize the acts of same-sex sexual acts themselves, but also the identity of even identifying or even supporting or advocating for queerness in general. While the laws are a little bit rudimentary in their understanding of queerness, they don't really distinguish, for example, between who is a trans person or who is an intersex person or who is a gay person. They kind of lump everything, both sexual orientation and gender identity, into one package of being gay or being unnatural, acting unnaturally or against the order of nature and things like that. So the most, you could say the most vitriolic, the most severe of these laws is what we call the SSMPA, the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, which was enacted in 2014. And that act essentially has become the federal law in Nigeria now that everyone uses, as the police especially, to arrest arbitrarily members of the public who they spot and perceive to be LGBT. And it's also used by the public in general to push back or resist any kind of campaign or activism that, oh no, it is illegal. It is illegal. If you want to do your activism, first go and change the law, which in itself is funny, because first of all, you criminalize the activism, then you say, if activists want to work, they need to go and change the law first. Like, you cannot work under this because it is illegal. But a different scenario has been imagined, however, over the last few years. So, for example, on social media, there is a sense that there is an increasing tolerance for the community in Nigeria. People are less inclined towards homophobic slurs now because there's an almost always instant pushback. You also see that, in fact, I think sometime in 2019, there was a trend on Twitter where it was say no to homophobia in Nigeria for the whole day. And typically conservative people were joining this trend. And why was this? Because somebody had been murdered, and the way social media amplifies the news story, at least that day, it gave everyone a little bit of conscience, and they were like, oh no, we don't want it. This is not what we are about. We are not trying to kill people. We are not trying to, be violent as a country. It was just for one day, but that also said something. However, what happens on social media is not necessarily what happens outside social media, because in the everyday world, the country is still very much hostile towards publicly declaring yourself as LGBT, walking down the streets, visibly queer, or at the very least, even being supportive of other queer people. But it's a little bit nuanced in how that discrimination and violence manifests. So there are issues around, for example, your class, your status in society that would also determine how people deal with you. For example, if you are middle class to upper class, you are likely to be, if not internally, comfortable, but at least externally comfortable, in the sense that you are going to be based in a special location where your privacy is respected. You're going to have dealing with the kind of people who also are, in a sense, progressive because of their economic class and because of their well-traveled, they've gone around, so they are not as vitriolic as other people. On the other hand, for the majority of socioeconomically deprived people in the country, sexuality is still something that is an easy moral panic causing scenario where the politicians can use it as a way of distracting away from political issues. And so just say, oh, we arrested 200 people. And that still happens, mass arrest. We arrested 70 people. We arrested 20 people at a gay party. And that causes some sensationalism in the news. And everybody just focuses on that for a while. So at the end of the day, activism is a little bit tricky because you have to navigate these different issues. Sometimes this question is, do we want to actually make an issue of this because the government is not actively prosecuting and we don't want to actually create the backlash? Or do we actually want to stand up and speak up, even though we know that it can result in more attention and more backlash? But yes, I think that captures the general overview. And then we can go into other issues.
So thank you so much, Ayo. This was super useful. And I think that both all the nuances of class, or what we often talk about as intersectionality, that sort of discrimination is different depending on which section of society you belong to and which sort of aspect of discrimination that interact. So, but also that there are sort of ambiguities in the situation becoming more liberal, but only for some, and also that the way the laws interact with society. So thanks a lot. And I would actually like to go to Sudan. Are there similarities or differences? I mean, we didn't speak about the Muslim part of Nigeria. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. But of course, religion also plays a role in Nigeria, but also in Sudan. So what would you say?
There are definitely similarities in the sense that the environment in Sudan is also quite hostile. But I have to start by saying that there have been some political changes in Sudan. So Sudan in 2019, there was a revolution. And the Islamist sort of dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir was ousted after 30 years in government. And that regime was quite hostile towards LGBT community. And legally, there was death penalty on homosexuality. And there were also public order laws, which were very vague in its formulation, so that, the public order police were basically granted the authority to arrest and harass people who did not conform to the moral codes of Islamism, whether that would be, the way that they dress or behave. And those codes were, of course, very heteronormative. So if, men or women sort of looked more masculine or feminine than what society expected them to look like, then they would be a target of arrest from public order police. So although homosexuality was punishable with death, that seldom happened, but the public order laws were more widely used as a means to suppress and oppress LGBT community, and also more generally women But as I said, in 2019, there was a revolution. We had a transitional government for a very short period, unfortunately, until a military coup in October last year. In that period, there was some legal changes that, at least on paper, would open up or would potentially make a difference in terms of both granting political and social space for the LGBT community and activists. And the main one was that the public order laws were abolished. And the second was as part of sort of an attempt to de-Islamize some of the laws in Sudan. The death penalty on homosexuality was removed, but homosexuality remained a crime, which would potentially put you in prison for life. So it wasn't a major step, but a small step. But these legal changes did not come from a place of we want to support LGBT rights. It was the public order laws were removed because they were renowned for being very discriminatory towards women. And as I said, the removal of the death penalty was more as part of a larger effort to de-Islamize some of the laws that the Islamists put in place. However, the fact that the public order laws were removed has granted some sort of space for the LGBT community, but I would say mainly in sort of the upper classes inside the capital. I don't think that sort of legal change is felt outside of Khartoum. So there was, for a small period, a little bit of political space, but at the same time, I think this sort of revolution, which also many from the LGBT community participated in, there was this growing realization that even though we have sort of a political change, we got rid of the Islamists, there is extreme societal homophobia, and that just makes it very, very difficult to be an LGBT activist in Sudan. There is a lot of violence, gender-based violence against LGBT persons within the family and at the societal level. So LGBT organizations, even though they start to sort of form themselves and perhaps in a bit more public way than before, they face many, many difficulties in their activism. And the most important is probably that a lot of the people within the LGBT community have internalized homophobia. So for them to go out and like declare themselves as an activist is a very long way to go, because they still feel like, you know, what they are is there's something wrong with them. It's not Islamic. They're not supposed to be that way, right? So they are, of course, afraid of violence against their own, from their own family, but also to put shame on their family, because if they go out there, they will also put a bad sort of image on their family, and that really holds them back. So even though we could say that there has been a small sort of political opening, the homophobia, which is often internalized, really puts sort of hampers a very public LGBT sort of activism. So.
Thanks a lot, Liv. That was really, really important and interesting. Did you want to add something? No. Ayo, could I just ask you to comment on this a little bit, because of, I mean, as many would know, there are also Islamic states in Nigeria. Is there a difference in those states?
Yes, there's a definite difference. So in the north of Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim, there is little to no type of open and visible activism advocacy. A lot of that happens in the south of Nigeria, which is predominantly Christian. And then people who are in the community work more underground in the north. And that's also principally because they while the sentence for same-sex acts in the South is, it ranges from 7 years to 14 years in prison, the sentence in the North is up to the death sentence. So it's a much more, what do you call it, restrictive environment in that sense.
Thanks, thank you very much. And it was also, I mean, Liv, also that you spoke to the same issues that I was speaking to in terms of class making a difference. The urban, more higher income sectors and of society having a bit more space.
Yeah, and those are the ones that are starting to come together, right? And it's in the capital. But the further you go from the capital, the more isolated those that are part of the LGBT community are. So yeah, it's really small steps, but you know, there are something really interesting happening.
But interesting that things are also moving. Matthew,
Yeah.
When you hear this from the Kenyan perspective, what is different and what is similar? Do you recognize some of these patterns?
Yeah, so excuse me, Jesus, sorry, very loudly. So there are similarities and there are differences. And I guess the way I will approach this is by tying it back to what Lise was talking about. What do these activistic organizations actually do on the ground, right? What sort of activism are we actually talking about? So in the Kenyan case, we can think about it as being either legal activism, right? Can you go to the parliament and have the politicians actually change laws? Are you going to use the courts? You're going to have put up challenges, legal challenges in court to have things changed, or you're going to protest on the streets, which is about mass mobilization, right? If we think about the Kenyan case, a lot of where identity activism came from stemmed from a medical epidemic, so the HIV crisis, right? So there were laws in place and working with ministries and bureaucracies through the IMF, World Bank, to provide medication and help to MSM, men's who sleep with men communities. And over time, these spaces that were created for the queer community and men who slept with men who were vulnerable to contracting the HIV disease, community activism started there, right? And they started having a voice and wanted to become more public. However, the legal system wasn't one where you could just go and lobby for changes in law, right? Because the carnal knowledge laws from colonial era still existed, right? So it's still illegal in Kenya to have carnal knowledge, which we don't know what carnal knowledge actually means, though it is like sex between men, and you can get up to 14 years in prison. So what has happened is that the courts have changed. There's been a constitutional reform, which has allowed for the way the court reforms have happened for people to actually make legal contest in court. And this has been successful for particular groups within the queer community. So that is the intersex group and those who are transgender, right? The court recognizes that gender identity should be protected under the Constitution. So that has been protected. So as a trans person, you have rights, you can get your documents. As an intersex child, which, yeah, if you're intersex, the court also recognizes your rights, right? The court also recognizes the rights of association. So LGBT groups, for instance, can form organizations, can come together, can be members in these organizations. However, your identity as an LGBTQIA person, as an LBQI and an A, right? Those parts of the identity are not recognized under the law. So you can still be punishable as an individual that way. So it's quite a very nuanced and complicated way of sort of navigating the space. Yes, I can organize. Yes, I can have an LGBTQIA organization, but my identity as an LGBTQIA person, depending on which group I'm in, is not protected, right? So then this is where, if the courts are not working, can I go to the streets, right? And sometimes they do. So recently, there have been protests against where the Ministry of Education is trying to say, if your child is LGBTQIA, they cannot be in a boarding school. They have to leave boarding school and go to a day school because they are a threat to the other students. So the queer community came together and tried to protest. And though protest as a form of demonstration is permissible, the police refused to grant them a permit, right? So this is something that sometimes they do. Or there was a festival that was supposed to happen, and the police said, this festival cannot go on because we cannot guarantee your safety. So there's still a lot of social stigma that is around the queer community and how they're able to actually organize and participate in society. So I would be very cautious, at least in the Kenyan case, to draw distinctions and say it's sort of a 2 steps forward, 3 steps back sort of dance that keeps happening. And I think largely that's because the courts have been very strong and pushing back on the legal dynamics that are happening in Parliament, right? Or politicians trying to politicize the identity, right? So election season is coming up, and what usually happens is press statements from rival groups saying this politician is being endorsed by the LGBTQ community as a way of signaling to the public, don't vote for this politician, right? And so these organizations are constantly having to be aware of how their organizations are being used as a political tactic to avoid getting drawn into the political space, but also to protect the members. Because imagine if you hear that if a politician is being endorsed by a group that you absolutely loathe, you're more likely to commit violence against them, right? So you have to be constantly vigilant on how you navigate that space.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. Would you also like some of these issues around sort of urban, rural, higher class? Do you see some of these issues as well in Kenya? In terms of social acceptability?
So social acceptability, I think that's also it's a very difficult question in some ways, right? So in the rural areas, I would say it's much less discussed and much more difficult for people. So people usually migrate to urban centers because that's where you find your people, so to speak, right? And that I think happens throughout the world. People who grew up in small cities or villages, I think, no, there's no one like me here, I'm going to move to the big city, right? But in the big city, right, there's still the social stigma. So finding a job, finding housing, right, those become very difficult. So you tend to come together to people who are like-minded, but then that also limits sometimes the sort of spaces you have access to, unless you are from a upper class background, right? And in places where money and power matter, if you're upper class, it's much less likely that you will suffer the same stigma that somebody who's from a less disadvantaged, or a less disadvantaged situation is. Religion is also playing a big role, right? So it's not just urban, rural, but also this notion that God provides everything, God is a protector, that we need to follow the Bible, but also international influence domestically, right? So next door in Uganda, you had the Kill the Gays bill, right? And so it's not just a homegrown movement, but it's one that was influenced a lot by international religious organizations that were trying to lobby for changes in law. So the urban, rural, religion, and it's still matter.
Very interesting. What about Zambia, Lisa?
So first of all, I mean, I'm an outsider. So I mean, and so that this is, we have to expect to sort of accept that my perspective is an outsider, and the way people speak to me about these issues is also very much that I'm an outsider. I'm a woman, I'm from the West. I'm also from, a country that traditionally has given a lot of money to Zambia, for aid. So I think a lot of the conversations that I've had we sort of have to take it in that perspective. But listening to this conversation and thinking about why we are here, and we're marking, the 50 years of decriminalization of the homosexuality in Norway. I think for me, Zambia kind of portrays what I imagine Norway was like 70 years ago. Because yes, there is, there is sodomy law, just like Nigeria. This is back, this is back from the Brits, and this is back from colonial times. And this is sort of a sleeping law, to the extent that it sort of becomes awakened when some people need to awaken it. It becomes politicized when you need to attack, an enemy politician, opposition politician, or something like that. So kind of between elections and, if you don't have any big public enemies, this is sort of a sleeping law. And a lot of people say to me, it's better like this. I mean, we are, things are okay. We are left in peace. And this carnal knowledge comes in. Nobody really knows what it is. Well, we do know that it has something to do with two men being in the same bed. But to be very specific. Two men being in the same bed has to be witnessed doing something more than sleeping. Now, I mean, that's very seldom that people have witnesses to what they do in bed when they're not sleeping. So, you know, actually to catch somebody in carnal knowledge is not very easy. So a lot of, when people get thrown to court or, you know, in prison for, acts of sodomy, very often you can, and again, back to having a bit of money, if you have a lawyer, the lawyer can say, okay, so where are the witnesses? Who's seen, you know, whatever is taking place between these? And please call witnesses. See, and this now almost always works. And, you know, the case gets thrown out. But this, again, you live in a city, you have money to have a court case, you have money to have a lawyer. So this is sort of, in a sense, a kind of a class issue. The other downside of this not being a political situation where you have very open gay LGBT organizations, is this actually kind of a problem, is a big problem for women. It's a big problem for lesbians because they don't really, they're sort of invisible. They're not seen by anyone. And so it's sort of just, and a lot of women have a lot of sort of pretty harsh sort of informal pressures. So you are 25-year-old, you live in a city, you wear pants, you don't have a boyfriend. You get called back to your village by your parents. And, you know, there's a lot of sort of transformation therapy, church, witchcraft, kind of really pretty bad stuff going on. And it's a lot of it. It's a kind of the pullback from the village. And it's all the kind of, you know, wearing pants if you're a girl and you're more than 25. That's seen as a problem. So here's the thing, you know, in a situation like Uganda, where this is, you know, the Kill the Gay bill has been so politicized, so ugly. The flip side is that it's become very open. It's become very politicized. And you also have kind of international support. When this issue is dormant and it's like, shh, let's not talk about it. It's also really difficult to, you know, to find your peers, to actually find support in being part of a group. So again, it becomes, just like you said, it becomes enormously internalized. The shame of being different, the shame that you're putting on your family, and, you know, maybe even the shame of not having money for a court case. And so it's, I'm kind of imagining what it would be like to be a gay person in Norway 60, 70 years ago. Because I think that would be exactly the same thing. Shh, it's a shame. We're not talking about it. So that's sort of how I see Zambia.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is interesting because, of course, in all of these contexts, there is criminalization of sort of not necessarily identity, but at least sort of sexuality or sexual acts, and sort of and also that your identity is not protected. It is shameful, and I think that is interesting because that's, of course, a very important role of law. Always, the moral effects of law, the moral signaling that law does. So when something is criminalized, that's it. So in most of these countries, it's very rarely actually enforced. So it's not that, like I was saying, you might have sort of situations where the police round up people at a party and then keep them for a while and then they'll go. But it's very rare that people are actually incarcerated and for longer times, and also sort of convicted. That's rare. But of course, the effect that it has on everyone, that this is criminal, that the effects of that is really important. I want to open up. I'll take a small round, but I want to open up. So just sort of keep your questions ready. Also, if you follow online. But and while you're thinking, I'm going to go back to the panel and starting with Ayo. When it comes to sort of in this, would you sort of what are the? I mean, you've spoken to a lot of activists about their situation, but also their strategies. So how is it? How are they? Because of course, these are really, these are really sort of careful and considerate activists often with a lot of experience. So how do they think about this navigation? How do they navigate? You've spoken a little bit about it, but you could say more.
So as part of my thesis, I had to do a lot of research on how advocates in Nigeria navigate this whole environment and the kind of strategies that they bring about. So part of what I brought about, I categorized in different ways, but I'm not going to go into that categorization now. Instead, I'll try to speak in a more chronological way. So in the beginning, prior to the new wave of homophobia that has taken over a lot of African countries in the early 2000s till date, most of the work that was done underground, because there was no public debate on it. There was no real need for the activists to come out and be out in the streets at all at that point. So the kind of work they did was just the occasional bailing somebody out who has been arrested by the police, rallying money around for supporting somebody who wants to look for a safe place to stay from the family, or even just helping with HIV/AIDS and other healthcare treatments and so on. So it was really very kind of community level work rather than advocacy in the broader sense. But one of the things that this new wave of homophobia brought about was that it opened the floor for conversation, and it opened up spaces, in a sense, inadvertently, for people to actually start contesting the nature of homophobia in the country. And so between the mid-2000s, 2010s, 2011s, advocates started focusing more on human rights discourse by, for example, putting out policy papers, going before international treaty bodies like the African Commission or the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and presenting statements showcasing the situation in Nigeria and hoping for some kind of international human rights pressure on the government. They also started engaging with pop culture, creating movies, creating pamphlets and literature that could appeal to the, to the story, to the emotional side of people, and make them feel connected to individuals in the community, rather than just this from afar stereotypes and biases that most people in Nigeria had. So all of this were used as, again, trying to preach a human rights philosophy, a human rights ideology to the wider society. And part of that preaching, in a sense, also included doing strategic litigation, going to the courts, saying, oh, we have a constitution, we believe in human rights, and human rights suggests, like what has happened in Kenya, that we should have the freedom to associate, we should have the freedom to, at the very least, be free of direct violence and oppressive conduct and all of that. And so laws that restrict that should be unconstitutional. This is logical, this is sensible. But unfortunately, none of these cases have succeeded, because every time the courts either excuse themselves on a technicality like the standing to bring the case, or they just say that, look, it's illegal and the legislature has made it illegal. So we are not going to overturn what the legislature has done, which is weird because they do overturn other things the legislature does, other issues. But when it suddenly comes to the issue of sexuality, they decide that the law doesn't necessarily have to be interpreted constitutionally. Now it should be interpreted from the notion of, morals or culture or religion. Sorry, Siri. That people think is the majoritarian philosophy. So I think with this kind of frustrations, over the last few years now, activists have begun to turn towards a different approach, which is now about focusing inwards and understanding that, look, we live in a country where democracy and the rule of law are not going to necessarily help us navigate or promote our issues, because this is not a solid democracy. This is not a country where the rule of law is sacrosanct, and we do not have a system where court decisions can be obeyed, or that courts even have the independence to make impartial decisions. And I think that understanding is beginning to sink in. And that is why a lot of strategies that work well in a better democracy or a stronger democracy seem not to work at all in a country like Nigeria. So people have decided to turn towards that. What we would do now, maybe, is to begin to navigate the nuances of power in the society. How do we make members of the community more powerful within the society, and then create a process where we can use our own power to protect ourselves rather than trying to use the law to protect ourselves. And so part of that power dynamics is like focusing and this is not the most ideal, on respectability. You know, we do not have to look gay. We can at least act in a way that conforms with the hegemonic notions of a good citizen, even if we are gay at all. That, of course, means that it erases self-actualization for a lot of members of the community. It also makes it difficult for actual entry or access for everyone. Only a few people can use respectability to navigate power in the country. But there is also the idea that, okay, let us focus on economic empowerment for members of the community, either through skill acquisitions or scholarships and other kinds of economic opportunities for businesses, loans, and all of this, so that when they get more relevance within the Nigeria socioeconomic system, when they get more status, they as individuals can at least buy some kind of protection. You can buy police protection, for example. You can exert power. And we've seen a couple of instances where openly, at the very least, queer people have become national celebrities because they are perceived to be very, very wealthy. You know, they have access to millionaires or billionaires, and so they can be free celebrities without anybody coming after them because they are protected by these power systems and power structures in the country. So one other thing people have been doing is kind of like intersectional issues, like, okay, let's mainstream our activity rather than focus on LGBT and sexuality and gender issues. Let's focus on issues around constitutionalism, because at the end of the day, the problem that is affecting us is about how power is distributed in the current political system. So let us change that political system, and in that process, we would also get a better political system that can protect everyone more broadly.
Thank you so much. That is really, really, really important. We're starting to get some questions, but I would like, I see that we have people in the audience here who know a lot about what happened in Norway 50 years back and the Norwegian struggles. So I was just wondering if any of you would like to sort of reflect a little bit on what you're hearing now back to the Norwegian context. Maybe Tone? But you have a microphone. You don't need to come here, actually. Yeah. because I think that is really important to try and see. So Tone Ellison is you were initiating the Queer Archives in Bergen. You're a professor of cultural studies and have different projects looking at both contemporary and historical issues around queer struggles in Norway. So it was very difficult. It was very tempting. And there are many other people here who could say something, but please, if you could just reflect a little bit.
I'm not sure I can reflect, but I'll try. And first of all, thank you so much for these nuanced and complex descriptions and analysis of these four contexts. And what I was thinking of is, I would like to know so much more about these contexts and also historical.
You can ask as well.
Thank you. And also the historical context, because what you were talking about is partly a framework of colonial law, and then partly a framework of course, this kind of global homosexual modern identity. So the modern homosexual identity, that has been kind of a global identity. And I was wondering very much when I was listening to you, are there other frameworks in these four countries? And you were talking about the rural urban context. So back in the villages or deep in the city, are there also other kind of frameworks for understanding same-sex love or connections? Was it possible for men to have sex with other men if they did not define themselves as gay? If you were a respectable female couple, was that possible back in the village in some kind of way? Were there other frameworks than this colonial law and the modern gay identity framework? So yeah, and then for the Norwegian context, we can come back to that. But of course, I agree with Lise that you see so many similarities too about how these development goes and this kind of cultural negotiations of what is okay and not. But I also think the four you pointed to, there are many similarities, but there are also local differences, and they get politicized in different ways. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Tuna. And also everyone who has questions, I think the best way of doing is that you just line up here, because you'll need to speak into the microphone, and then you can just line up and I'll see you. But I want to get back to give all of you a chance to reflect on Tuna's comments. Who wants to go first? Yes. No. Matt, you can.
So that's a really good question about whether there are the local understandings of these identities pre-colonial and currently, right? So there are certain communities' rites of passage where once the boys are circumcised, they sort of get to play with each other. But then that is the extent which happens, right? Sort of the sexual knowledge and upbringing sort of happens in that context, but does not continue past the rites of passage period, right? There are other communities where there are woman-to-woman marriages. If a woman is not able to have children of her own, she's able to acquire a younger woman and have that woman live with her and produce babies for her, right? So that still exists and it's still accepted. And then there are other communities where, because marriage is so important to sort of this idea of who a person is and how they are linked to the community, where women can actually, if they desire to be single, they can pay their own bride wealth, right? Because in some communities, in order for your younger siblings to get married, if the oldest is not married yet, your children cannot get any bride wealth, for instance, if that is still a thing. So then women who are independent and very successful are able to purchase their own freedom from that sort of system in order to help their own children get married in the future. So there are different sort of notions of what gender is and how sexuality is constructed and how that is tied to marriage, for instance.
I think the Sudanese case is a bit different because we're not talking about colonial law, we're talking about Islamic law. So it's not the law that came from outside, it's you know, and that changes the dynamic a bit. So in Sudan, you don't have these discourses of, you know, these Westerners came and imposed this law on us. It's more, you know, it was more tied to the Islamist political project in Sudan, and getting rid of them was very important in sort of a trajectory of changing the circumstances of the LGBT community. When you talk to the community, they have they always say that there were much more societal tolerance before the Islamists came to power, and that extended not only in urban areas but also to rural areas of Sudan. When it comes to this, you know, gender fluidity, I don't think the Sudanese context has, I mean, there's always been this idea of the families, man and woman in marriage together, very sort of heteronormative in that sense, but there was more tolerance for people to be different, but not gender fluid in that sense, I think, I would say. But can I take the opportunity? I didn't get to say how LGBT organizations actually work in Sudan.
Yes, you can. You can.
I think that is important. Because, I mean, like I said, it's a very hostile environment, so there's no sort of very public mobilization. So the main strategy has been to support the women's movement, even though part of the women's movement is quite hostile towards LGBT rights. So in terms of changing laws, they have just silently supported those other movements who wanted to remove particularly the public order law. But the way that they are working themselves is more tackling the internalized homophobia. And they're doing that in two ways. One is to basically document the discrimination and violence that are facing the community. They're collecting life stories. And not only life stories from the sort of urban middle classes, but all over the country, and from all the letters in the umbrella of LGBT. And, you know, violence and discrimination within the family, practices of like forced marriage, of conversion, etc. From the community in sort of work life, in health sector. In addition to that, they are sort of trying to create groups of, what can I call them, self-acceptance. They are trying to, it is more sort of aimed at empowerment within. So they are gathering the community in terms of, you know, learning them about rights, that it's okay to be, you know, you should embrace your sexuality and gender identity without feeling shame. So it's kind of like moving and also helping people maneuver, right? Because sometimes people have very complex identities. Like I said, forced marriage, for example, is quite common. So I interviewed a trans man who also have to maneuver being a divorced woman and single mother. You know, and that is not easy in Sudan. So, but the help, or you feel that you finally have like a community that supports you in that endeavor, is really, really, can be really empowering. And the way that they see this work, at least the leaders of these organizations, are that they are preparing the ground for movement, like in the future. They foresee that in the future, when the community has been empowered, that they will demand, you know, rights and dignity and be more publicly vocal about these issues.
Thank you, Liv, and sorry for jumping.
No,
on.
it's okay.
No, that's really interesting, and in a way, it also what I was saying previously is that in some ways that's also where the community is sort of putting emphasis in Nigeria, looking more towards internal community building. So that's also an interesting sort of similarity, but Ayo, when you listen to Tuna and her question about sort of whether there were other models of thinking about maybe gender identity, but also same-sex relations and intimacy previously, is that do you have any reflections on that?
So I always caveat responses around Nigeria's sociocultural environment with the fact that Nigeria has over 300 ethnicities. So there are very different models and different ways of, you know, looking at issues. But yes, there have been enough evidence to suggest that across the diversity of ethnicities, there are ways of being and of existing that were accommodating, not in, of course, the framework we have today of LGBTIQ+, but they were accommodating of gender fluidity, of non-binary natures, you know, and of the idea that the world is not strictly heteronormative. So, for example, we have a culture where a woman at a certain point could be allowed to take another woman as a wife because of bearing a child for a lineage or something like that. So that the lineage continues. You know, there are different ways of looking at it. In other cultures, there is the idea that women can become men, in the sense that they have demonstrated that roles that were actively reserved for men in the society are things they've taken up, and so they have all the honor and all the privileges that men in that society have. There are cultures where you have a subculture of men who love other men and who are with other men. And we still have other cultures where the idea of performance masquerades in traditional systems, so in traditional festivals, are not gender-based. So you could have a man performing as a woman for that purpose, dressed as a woman and acting in every way that a woman is expected to act, and that was considered part of the cultural nuances around gender because it is not, strictly defined around heteronormativity. But the issue, of course, is that none of this means any of them is progressive in the sense we use the words today. Neither does it mean that any of these framings clearly identified natures around, for example, male, female, non-gendered or gender binary and things like that. So we don't have those frameworks. But again, the example I use that I illustrate with people is we did not have a University of Oxford or Cambridge in African systems, but that didn't mean we didn't have education. So the framings may be different and we may not be able to correlate it to our understanding of how these things are to us today, especially those of us in the advocacy work, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist or the understanding did not exist.
Thank you very much. If there are any questions from the audience here, please come. And then while Lise Marie is coming up, I'm going to ask the panel a question from the digital audience, which is, and the question is, there are actually two, but the first question is on what is called autocratic gender washing, which is about autocratic regimes using their good performance on gender issues, maybe usually women's rights and women's representation, to prove their moral standing, so it. Yes, and sort of showing that they are democratic in other ways, and that this has good impacts, for instance, on corruption. So the example given here is Rwanda, which was early in enacting gender quotas for women's representation. Also Uganda, and that this is then proving their democratic credentials. Is this? So I think that the question is, do we see this? Is this something that you also see in these countries? But also, is this something that is, I'm adding this, but is this something that also sort of relates to LGBT issues in any way? So it's the opposite. Lisa wants to start.
I could start anyway. God, there are so many issues I wanted to touch on in the former debate, and I realized time has run out. So, but I think here is the thing. Yes, gender washing it's a clear phenomenon in autocratic states in Africa. You use international gender law, and you sign on to CEDAW, you sign on to this, and there is a sign of you being progressive in some form, while at the same time, like in Kagame's case, being, on the verge of becoming a personalized dictator with, no sort of stop guards around. This hasn't, from my knowledge, and this is where my co-panelists hopefully will prove me wrong, I haven't seen kind of an LGBT washing. Honestly speaking, LGBT is not a selling point for autocrats. And they use it, but they don't use it for, it's not to their favor, because, it's a very kind of, in the more sort of politicized political rhetorics around in autocratization, homophobia is also, it's kind of it's more of a weapon. And so I haven't seen any evidence of LGBT washing. So pink washing in African autocratic states, no.
Any other comments on this? Anyone else want to comment on that?
I think, yes, there has been no pink washing, but we also have to remember that the international community has tried to tie pink washing to aid, and that has actually led to backlash against these communities. Right?
That was the second question. Excellent. Excellent, yeah.
And that actually, I think, leads a little bit to the second question online. So maybe we'll do that as well, if you can just move it up. Could you say more on the role of the international community and NGOs? Are there different political strategies that can be seen in different national contexts? What ones have been more successful? Furthermore, do you see a large discrepancy in these matters between the courts and legislative bodies, in contrast to major political parties that may set the agenda for political discussion? So I think that the general, well, you can all read it, but more sort of the more general aspect of that, it goes to the international community and NGOs.
But didn't Batu just answer it?
Yes, so I think you did to some extent.
Yeah.
So I'll leave that and you can come back to it later, but I want to have Lisa Marie's question now.
Thank you so much. My question is fairly short. I'm also curious about the role of sort of social elites and social allies within national context. And I've been especially curious about the Nigerian case. You mentioned, of course, that some LGBTQI activists or advocates themselves can become celebrities. So I'm curious, I mean, do they find any sort of advocates or supporters or just voices also speaking up for them in the sort of celebrity arenas and layers, and forums of people. And also, I mean, I'm just a little bit familiar with the Ghanaian case, and I think Nigeria and Ghana are interesting in the fact that, in the sense that, they have so many, I mean, as many African countries do, but a very active sort of diaspora and sort of Nigerian and Ghanaian expatriates living elsewhere and also actually coming home. Also, like Ghana had a strong campaign, like the year of returns. I mean, people come back to Ghana, and that is really creating some interesting meetings. That's my question, basically. Then thank you so much. This is very, very interesting.
Excellent question. So would you like to start?
I want to hear about Nollywood.
Yes. Yeah. So let's hear from Nigeria.
So indeed, at a certain level of socioeconomic ability and status, one begins to transcend laws in Nigeria. So what is applicable to politicians is also, in a sense, applicable to celebrities or very wealthy people. The laws begin to be suggestions rather than real enforceable norms. So, and I think a part of it is it's linked to what I said earlier about how we have traditional systems where at festivals, rules are bent because it's understood that these people are special, they are divinity at this point. So it's kind of like an extension of that idea that, when you get to celebrity status, you have, in a sense, a touch of madness on you. So you are allowed to be and to do anything you like. Now, unfortunately, I would not go so far as to say that those who have gotten that status are actively representative of the community or are actively engaged with advocacy for the community. If it is more of an individual benefit than a communal one, because you would literally have a situation where everybody has just applauded for this person on stage who is visibly, expressive in a queer manner, and go right out from the concerts and murder a person walking down the streets. So there is no direct correlation between the reverence or the applause for the celebrity and protection for the wider society or the wider community. And then secondly, there is still there are still people who are, in a sense, members of the elites, political elite, or even the economic elite, who could use their power to push. But there is also the fear that their status as members of the elite would be withdrawn or upset or threatened by visibly aligning with the community. So the best that we have seen so far is that they channel funds through the back, so to say, to advocacy organizations. They support it in the background, but never openly, never visibly. And then there is finally the third point, that there is also classism within the LGBTIQ plus community. And that classism, in a sense, mirrors that of the wider society. So that being of the same class is a stronger identity for a number of people than being of the same sexuality or being of the same gender identity. So that in itself means that there are queer people who see themselves first as elite people rather than queer people. And so I'm more interested in keeping that structure of society the way it is, because it is to their benefit and the benefit of their, straight heteronormative friends. So they sympathize more with their elitist heteronormativity than they do with the wider problems or challenges of the community. So that itself means that there is no real concerted or coordinated effort to make use of all of the power dynamics and economic access to, improve the lives of the community in general.
Thank you very much. Do any of you want to get in on that? If not, I could just sort of follow up a little bit, because there is a sort of parallel or sort of adjacent strategy that we see, for instance, used by LGBT activists in Uganda, SMUG, the Sexual Minorities Uganda, for instance, which is to link up to international celebrities. So where the LGBT movement would, if you follow the head of Frank Mugisha, who's the head of Sexual Minorities Uganda on Instagram, for instance, you will see that he will regularly post pictures of himself with international celebrities. Like it could be sort of politicians like the ambassador from the US to Uganda,
Kiko from Bergen.
or Kiko from Bergen, or other sort of US politicians, former presidents. You would sort of see that he will sort of signal support from a broader celebrity community to the struggle, which is another way of sort of linking to the international and using the same sort of logic in a way, but also in a different way. So I was just wondering, I'm wondering about two things. So one is that something that we see more broadly? Well, one more thing that I know that they've been trying to do is to link up to them, particularly using football. And linking up to the sports community, and that has been done in Norway to some extent, with this say no to homophobia in football, but also sort of using this part of the international linkage. So is that something that we see more broadly, and also sort of to what extent does this work to your from your perspective? Does it is there a risk of backlash there as well, or is this something that changes people's minds and their hearts and minds to some extent?
So this is so many interesting angles into this. So I think first of all, a lot of this has to do when an issue. So in some contrasting Zambia to Uganda. So Uganda has had terrible political situation for LGBT people, with a president wanting to have a death penalty for sexual minorities. So that is outrageous, by international standards, right? So that's awful, obviously awful, but it also provides international recognition and, in a sense, international protection. Whereas back to my case in this is the quiet case. This is the case where it's like an enormously Christian society. Everyone is a Christian. And being a Christian, you are obviously, men should marry women and you should have children and, all these things. And that is the norm. And then we have this, it's better that we don't talk about this, because if it becomes politicized, it becomes dangerous, because no one will protect this. If we, as an NGO, a lot of organizations have been met by, like NORAD, Norwegian authorities, many others, willing to finance the organization. And there is finances for this, and kind of encouraging the organizations to become more visible. They are very often extremely afraid of backlash. because you can talk to politicians. Minister of Health is all in favor of doing something to gay men in prison, to to actually have a focus on this. Talking to the Minister of Health, talking to them, outside Parliament, that's fine. In Parliament, they're all Christian and they're all sort of straightforward, sort of heteronormative people. So all politicians they feel there's a backlash of going sort of public. But seeing the case of Uganda as you present, it kind of shows that when things go really rough and bad, there may, in a strange sense, be some benefit to that. I hate using words like benefit, but you see what I mean? This silence, which I sort of think of this must have been Norway in the 40s and 50s, but I should talk more to you about that.
Yeah, go back to the 50s now. No.
Yeah, well,
it was 70s.
Yeah. Okay, so I've always been really bad at maths, right?
No,
Can you,
in Sudan, I mean, they are not really public, so no, there is no it would not be to their benefit, I think. But what is very interesting, they don't have a lot of allies and supporters, but we are seeing that, there is an emerging generational gap in the women's movement. There is a whole new generation of young female activists calling themselves feminists. And one of the issues of contentions between the older and the younger generation is sexual freedom. So we are seeing sort of increasing sort of alliances between the LGBT community and these younger feminists. And at least that makes me hopeful for going forward for Sudan, that they actually have someone on their team.
So I think the way I approach this question is first thinking, so what is the effect that we want these celebrities and these images to have? And how durable are those effects going to be, right? So in thinking about, I think it creates a certain signal, right? That yes, this is a norm that exists out there. They are well connected. But for the day-to-day sort of lived experience, I think it's very hard, right? There's a work that Lisa, two other colleagues and I are working on, three other colleagues are working on, where we've tried to manipulate the message people receive, right? So if we think about celebrities as being people who can, transfer the endorsement of being gay is okay, what happens if you actually make people think about a gay person is your cousin, is your relative? Does that move you, right? And we find that, yes, it does move people. It makes them more sympathetic. But if you look at this a couple of months down the line, especially after a court decision that comes in and says, we're not going to overturn any laws, all the positive effects that we found initially disappear, right? So it's okay. So when I think about celebrities, like celebrities can signal, oh yeah, that's fine. But if an institution like a court says, actually, this is a norm that goes against what is permissible in our society, then all that celebrity endorsement and communal sort of goodwill can disappear very quickly, right? So it's how do we create a sustained appreciation and activism that actually changes people's hearts and minds, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Ayo, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, no, not really. I do not think there is much advantage one way or the other with the Nigerian process for either the politicians or the celebrities. So in a sense, I think it's that worry again about losing status by visibly speaking up, because you can act, but once you begin to speak up or try to be, in a sense, forceful, then the backlash can be sudden and very imminent, and it will go both ways. So regardless of what power you have as an individual, it has to be, the situation has to have reached a certain level of consensus, and then you can voice that consensus rather than you trying to push or propel change or reform. So yeah, celebrities, politicians at high levels, whether autocratic or not, they all still they all still have that fear.
Thank you very much. I think I mean what we're talking about now also relates to this last question online on sort of the different different ways in which actors relate to, sort of domestic actors relate to the international environment. And of course, this is complex because one is funding. So it's funding for the organizations, but also for the governments. And actors use this in different ways. So governments have often sort of used, they mobilized the domestic homophobia, saying that sort of this is un-African and you should sort of foreigners should stay out of this. So it's been sort of a tug of war between the external community sort of saying we'll stop funding if the government is sort of explicitly and aggressively homophobic. And then there is this tug of war. And then there is the different ways in which NGOs relate to the international community, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of sort of using or not the international limelight to try and create protection to some extent for individuals in this community, and also sort of gain maybe a celebrity status. So I think this is an issue that we still need to understand better. I think for instance, there is this contested story from Zambia going back where there's sort of attempts from Norway actually to sort of the sort of visibility created around the LGBT community in Norway were seen as part of a backlash, and that this is a very complicated matter. And then of course the courts have their own logic because they relate to international. You were talking about that, Ayo, that domestic courts are used, but also regional courts, and there is this conversation between courts, international courts and domestic courts, and also sort of the academic community around law. I mean, both when it comes to advocates, when it comes to academics, and when it comes to judges, that they form part of a community that is quite international and transnational, where norms maybe travel more quickly than in other parts of the community. So that is so I think that we need to sort of think about this, that there are different logics that go to different organizations. We only have 2 minutes left. I would like to sort of give each of the panelists an opportunity to say have some final comments. I thought I would start with Lise and then end with Ayo.
Oh gosh, there's just so many things that I kind of wanted to touch upon, but I think this to think about how to organize and how to create in settings where, like we just heard about, where being visible is a potential threat, but then to maybe as for us as to actually help create organizations that are in a sense, how can I say, that can provide sort of safe arenas. And I think sometimes we need to be, as outsiders, wanting to help, wanting to support human rights defenders. We also have to be sort of have a very sort of close listening ear to the ground. It may be that a kind of a more vague, careful presentation of an organization is better, and to be not perfect and to be kind of compromising can be really important. And I think sort of just thinking about the context that we're in, but also realizing that even without people knowing it, you need a community. And you need sort of a safe space. So something, we should be less, I don't know, listen closely and be maybe less politically correct about how things should be, and just sort of try to back small initiatives. I think I want to stop there.
Thank you, Lisa. Matthew?
Sorry, I think what I would like to close on is just that we shouldn't think about the queer community as being monolithic, right? That we should think about how certain voices within those communities, for instance, gay men, tend to be much more vocal and louder and have more privilege than others, right? And how that creates tensions in the advocacy strategies that these groups are able to actually engage in. And I think if we realize that there are tensions within the groups, we might be able to actually help them or actually be able to figure out how their advocacy strategies are effective or ineffective.
Thank you, Matthew. Liv.
What do I want to, I think one of the lessons from Sudan at least is that, you know, if you have a very homophobic society, a change of regime might not differ as much as we might hope for, because even though those that come to power are not perhaps autocrats that, you know, try to benefit from a very homophobic politics, they still have those attitudes. So it you know, either way it becomes very difficult for LGBT groups to openly advocate for their rights. And that we just have to, like Lise say, start in the small and support initiatives and to support them on their own terms, you know, not force them to go public or to do their activism in a certain way, but you know, they know their context the best and they know where the red lines are, and we can't push organizations into situations where they are bound to meet both societal and political backlash.
Thank you, Liv. And then the last word for you, Ayo.
Thank you very much. Everyone has been really very great and enlightening listening to everyone. And of course, thank you to the team at the center for inviting me here. But I think I would like to close on this point, which is to say that a lot of what I have said today actually has focused on the traditional setups for advocacy and activism, NGOs, corporate structures, and all of that. But I would be remiss if I did not note that that is also rapidly changing. More and more, we are finding that individual members of the community, young people especially, are just doing their own advocacy in different ways through social media and through other outlets without traditional funding processes, without even incorporating or setting up. They are just getting out there and doing their things and just taking advantage of all the opportunities that a more connected world offers to bypass the traditional strictures that are in place. And of course, while it is probably too early to evaluate the good that it has done or the effect it has had, I still think that personally it's creating more awareness out there, and hopefully that awareness will translate into social change at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayo. So, and thank you all, and thank you for participating. And this has been an amazing hour and a half. I would have loved to just continue. And it's a great start to our Queer Lawfare series. And I would like to just also commend Ana Cortes, our colleague at the Central on Social Transformation, who unfortunately for sad family reasons couldn't be here today, has been organizing all this, sort of getting the seminar series together, thinking about this first seminar, and I think she will be, if she's following us or watching, she would be super happy to know that you all contributed to such a great intellectual exchange, nuanced reflections, and we're all looking forward to the continuation. So thanks a lot, and thank you for participating here, and I for participating online. Hope to see you in person soon.